Thanks so much for being here. I want to take a little time to discuss a little bit why we're doing what we're doing. We've decided to do a brand refresh for the brand Lufthansa, a brand that's been around for a very long time, that a lot of people know, and that has a lot of associations already that a lot of people carry for that brand. Nevertheless, we thought this would be a really important time for us to start looking at what's working for the brand and what isn't working for the brand. And we're lucky that we're starting off at a time when we've just been awarded with what's called the 5-Star Award from Skytrax, which recognizes a lot of the investments we've already done, which are part of what I would call the strategic long game that we're playing. And that long game has been to try to make sure that over a span of about 8 or 10 years, we evolve the brand into an even more premium carrier. It all started with the massive investment that we did in order to upgrade our business class on the Intercon fleet. We also then implemented the strategy of deploying a premium economy class. We've since deployed a lot of new service modules as it pertains to the business class, whether it's signature services or other elements that are heightening the personalization that we're trying to make as part of our new premium approach of our brand. And within that larger strategy, it only felt natural that we also took a look at what does the brand look like? Is it still that brand that is visibly depicting the premium that we're all trying to portray, and that is also in step with a lot of the developments that we've done? And so a couple of years ago, we started to do a little inventory. And that inventory started with a little depiction of what was the world like the last time that we actually did touch that brand. And for those who are not airline historians, 1989 was the last time that Lufthansa did a brand refresh. And at that point in time, for those that are a little bit more Germophile, they will know that's when Boris Becker and Steffi Graf won Wimbledon for the first time. Now, a lot of things I think have changed for most of us, for those of us who remember 1989, since then. And as a matter of fact, within Lufthansa, a lot of things have changed. Nothing inside a Lufthansa airplane, inside a Lufthansa lounge is the same as it was in 1989, only the external appearance. And so we felt like that was sufficient ground to take a hard look at where do we stand. The other impetus was the fact that the crane is turning 100 this year. The logo that has stood for the quality that Lufthansa represents is actually turning 100 years old this year. So we also felt like there was a little bit of a historic forcing function for us to investigate where do we stand and what do we want to do. When we did that excursion, we tried to discern where do we stand, not just from an aesthetic perspective, from a brand perspective, but also from a functional perspective. Again, since 1989, a lot of things have changed, particularly in the digital space. A lot of the things that had been designed from a brand perspective at the time were quite static, and that was okay. But since then, the world has become incredibly dynamic and incredibly agile, and a lot of things are happening on screens, large or small. And what we found out is that a lot of the elements that were designed at the time, which were designed by what we would call giants, and we really do think that from a brand perspective, we're standing on the shoulders of giants, we're just not capable of addressing the needs that are present today and that are the very big drivers of joy of use of the brand as it moves forward. And particularly emblematic for that was the fact that because we have two colors that are equally weighted, blue and yellow, it leaves a lot of space for interpretation. Now, we put together a little bit of a graphic here that's part of what we call our Hall of Shame, which depicts how many different kinds of logos you can encounter on a journey from Frankfurt to New York. There's too many interpretations, too much room for everybody to try to figure out what do they think Lufthansa should stand for, but that makes it very difficult for consumers to actually understand what Lufthansa stands for. So we decided that we needed to take a hard look at that, and we needed to focus on 3 dimensions when it came to what is it that we're trying to achieve. One is we wanted to become more premium. Why do we want to become more premium? Well, another development since 1989 is the fact that the airline category has evolved quite significantly. It used to be that pretty much most carriers within the European theater, at least, were in the center of the strategic matrix, if you want. They were national carriers that were all trying to do similar things in their limited geographies. You had an Alitalia for Italy, you had Iberia for Spain, you had British Airways, you had Lufthansa, you had Swiss. They were all doing similar things, only out of different regions. In the meantime, the category has evolved, and what has happened is that we have now a premium demand and we have a low-cost demand or a value demand. Now, Lufthansa was not in the optimal position to address that. Now, with the acquisition and the increase in the fleet for Eurowings, we now have built an airline that will compete and is already competing fantastically in the value segment. That has given Lufthansa the space to move up and say, okay, we can also move ourselves out of the center of the strategic matrix into a space where we're more premium and we can compete against the other premium carriers. The other thing that we've put a focus on is being digitally fit. As I outlined earlier, a lot of the things that we had were not functioning well on screens. And if you took the extremest of screens and Apple Watch, that was one of the things on which, the crane, the logo really was not functioning, the type wasn't functioning, a lot of elements were just not functioning. And last but not least, we wanted to provide a higher degree of clarity. And clarity for us has become so much more important as we're living in a world that is fast-moving, fleeting, oftentimes overtaxing. How can we become one of the brands that helps giving orientation, that helps kind of like making sure that people really know what to expect and what to anticipate every single time that they encounter us? So premium, digital fit, and clarity were the three big lenses that we put on top of what does the new brand have to accomplish. We then took a look at the component parts of the brand, if you will. So this gets a little geeky if you're not a brand expert, but there are three component parts of the brand. One is the logo, one is the color scheme, and the last is the type. We started out with the logo. We have the crane as our logo. And one of the principles that was guiding us throughout this entire journey was we don't need to reinvent, we don't need a revolution. What we need is to strengthen our strengths. The crane already is a well-recognized symbol for us, but as I outlined earlier, it wasn't functioning quite as well as it ought to be functioning anymore. So we took a look at what can we do that can change the crane and make it more modern, more capable of depicting the things that we did. And we call this a little bit of an exercise in ornithology. We were trying to figure out what kind of bird will best represent, or what kind of a shape of a bird can best represent that. So we took the crane and we did naturalistic and futuristic iterations of that until we landed in a space which just, again, strengthened the strength of what was already there. We made it a little bit lighter. We made the circle around it a little bit lighter so that it felt a little bit more free. We spread the wings apart a little bit more so that it was capable of actually being depicted on small screens. But as you can tell, it's, again, not a revolution, it's an evolution. But as we looked at it on multiple surfaces, from the smallest possible screen to the tail fin of one of our A380s, it was actually a much better functioning shape of crane than we had before. The second element we took a look at was the color scheme. This was probably the most emotional conversation that we had. If we had asked people in Lufthansa prior to this exercise, what color is Lufthansa, I think we would have gotten, and we did, about 50% saying yellow and the other 50% saying blue. Now, whilst that doesn't seem like a superficial problem at first, to the point that I was trying to make earlier, when it comes to clarity, we actually needed to decide on which of these two colors actually leads and which one is the one that is going to give the larger shape to how we want people to perceive Lufthansa. I also mentioned earlier that it's about premium. Now, if we think about colors and we think about which one is premium, most of us would agree a yellow suit in a business meeting might not necessarily exude premium quite as much as a blue suit might. So, like myself, I'm wearing a blue suit, jeans because marketing, but, nevertheless, the blue suit is much, much more emblematic of the premium that we're trying to depict. So blue is going to become the leading color for Lufthansa. And a lot of the broader applications, whether it is the counters, fronts that we're going to be deploying, plus the flags or a lot of other symbols that we have. But, and this is very, very important to us, yellow will play perhaps an even more important part moving forward because it is going to be a lot more deliberately deployed. We're going to use yellow in ways in which we have kind of intuitively used it in the past, but we're going to use it in a more systemic way moving forward. The first thing we're going to do with yellow is we're going to use it to provide orientation. For somebody who's never been at JFK and they're looking for Lufthansa, they're going to still see yellow at about a level of 1.70 meters and above. So most of the screens, the signage is still going to make it very easy for them to find Lufthansa. It's also going to be something that's going to still be distinct. So we're going to play with it. We're going to accentuate things with it. It is going to be something that's going to signal interaction and activation. So anytime we want somebody, particularly in a digital space, to interact with us, yellow is going to prompt them to do so. And perhaps most importantly, it's going to be the driver of the little twinkle in the eye. Now, blue is capable of not just being premium, but if we don't do it right, it's going to be a little bit too cold. So we want to have a lot of little surprises, a lot of little things that yellow can drive that will create little discoveries, that will create little moments of delight. And so throughout the entire journey, we will start deploying yellow in small iterations. We're going to always make it slightly surprising, but it's going to be there across the entire journey, whether we're looking at the formal parts of the uniform where all the accessories are going to highlight yellow, to the boarding pass, which in the past has been in a more gray color. And interesting in this case, we're actually using the digital version as the template because the digital boarding pass was already always yellow, but we're now going to make the printed version in yellow as well. And so we think it's actually quite lovely as somebody perhaps puts this into their pocket. There's going to be a little bit of a yellow accent on their blue suit. It's those kind of moments that we're trying to create with the yellow. So it's not always predictable. It's always going to be something that people are going to notice because it's not used quite as heavily. Now, the last part that we took a look at is the font. Now, this is where it gets really geeky. I had conversations with our lead designer, and one of the decisions that we made is that we're going to move away from the current font that we have, which is a Helvetica, which, like anybody else who uses it, we have to license and we have to pay annual fees in large numbers to use that. But Helvetica was actually not a font that's capable of being used on smaller digital screens. So we already always had a break kind of in our design logic between what our official font was and some of the fonts that we were using in increasing numbers on some of the digital spaces. So we decided we're going to create our own font. It's very, very close to the Helvetica, but it's going to be a lot more usable. Now, my favorite moment perhaps in the whole journey of the last 9 months plus was a conversation with our lead designer who pulled me apart and said, Alex, we really need to talk about the font. And I said, sure, let's talk anytime. So he pulls me over, and about 5 minutes into the conversation, he said, and now when the letter U comes, it's going to get really interesting. And I kind of looked at him, and it did turn out to become really interesting because, small letters make a very, very big impact. And the U also being part of our logo type had a couple of options in terms of how we could depict it. And whether or not you applied kind of like a straight line at the end of the U or not made a massive difference in the way that the brand appeared. So it was that level of granularity that we kept looking at and we kept, agonizing over what is the right way to do that. But I think the most fascinating piece to me was all of this was part of a larger mobile. Anytime you touch something on this point right here, it moved the entire construct around. We needed to recalibrate and make sure the whole thing still made sense and still fit, and this was still a systemic way of approaching things that gave orientation and all the other things that we wanted to. So this is just a little bit of an excursion into what the new font is going to look like. This would be the old font. So if we looked at something like a 7, which is a number that we use quite often, and we look at the new way of writing it, it's going to look a lot more dynamic. It's going to look a lot more distinctive than it does. Now, do I expect a lot of people on the outside to consciously recognize this and have kind of a cognitive moment when that happens? No, most people won't. But the overall feeling should be one that gives it an impression of being more dynamic, being more coherent as an entire brand than perhaps we've ever been before. And so I will start closing the conversation by pointing out this is the beginning of a journey. And this journey is going to still encompass a lot of work. And the way in which it became most clear to me was when we first drew up an inventory of all the in-flight items that we have on board. And I was guessing that perhaps we would have 50, 70 items on board that had a logo on it. It turns out it's 900. We have 900 items in flight, from a napkin to a glass to a spoon to whatever else, that currently have a logo on it. And so we've gone through this exercise of saying, okay, these are the ones that we need to replace. These are the ones that we can keep for the time being. These are the ones that perhaps don't need a logo. But it's just an illustration of the magnitude of the job. So beside the fact that we have to paint A380s, which is a job that takes a couple of weeks and costs enormous amounts of money, luckily, we have been able to compensate for all of those funds by having this included into the organic paint cycle, so we're not actually increasing our costs, but nevertheless, it's the magnitude of the job that kind of stood out for us every time. And on the other hand, we have to tend to, do we need a new logo on the little teaspoon in flight, and everything in between. So this is going to keep us very, very busy for a long time to come. We showed one more example of a new menu just to depict like one of the other iterations that we have and one of the other ways in which we're trying to depict premium, which is more authentic, which is a little bit less stylized than perhaps we had done things in the past. But it's going to be a journey that's going to keep us busy for many years to come. So this is one of the greatest jobs that I've ever had the privilege of being a part of. And I look forward to continuing this journey with an amazing team for a few more years to come. This is a shot from the live livery as we have just finished painting it in Rome. It's a much deeper blue. It almost has no more red in it. It has almost no white in it. It has a completely different brilliance and radiance. And we think it's going to be something that is going to be incredibly distinctive for us moving forward. So thank you so much.